I spent about 4 hours this week curating a PlayStation 2 library that I will probably never, ever play. But I think it might have been the happiest 4 hours of my week. I won't lie, things aren't actually going well for me at the moment. I mean, look, the YouTube stuff is great. YouTube is going great guns. But work, I've got my own business and it's just not doing very well. The sort of work I do, it's kind of seasonal is the way to think about it. It's always feast or famine. And I'm in a very long period of famine at the moment. I mean, you couldn't tell it to look at me, but still. And it all feeds into this, well, I'm getting older and I'm getting less capable of doing the sort of things that I used to be able to do when I was 19 years old. I've reached that age when a wild Saturday night is falling asleep on the sofa with a half-eaten bag of crisps. I made the noise today. You know the noise? The noise that you make when you sit down in a comfy chair, a sort of inevitable sigh of relief that activity is over for the time being. And you don't realise the sort of fatigue that creeps up on you. It's the sort of fatigue that you get at 11 o'clock at night after a long day of reviewing tech gadgets. You just want to have a nice hot drink before you go to bed, and so you wander into the kitchen and then you spend the next half hour trying to overclock the toaster. It isn't just my mind playing tricks on me either. Technology has this habit of adding friction into your life. I mean, my fridge asked me for a software update this morning, and I have never felt more ready to go and live in the woods. Because all of this takes mental energy and time, and increasingly the time that we just don't have. Right now, if a meal takes more than about 4 minutes to prepare, I can only really consider it for special occasions. This actually means macaroni and cheese is a legitimate contender for Christmas dinner. And yet, this is a niche where we tend to love that friction. Building a ROM collection, for example, it's part of the fun, and tinkering with devices is part of the experience. It's just not something that everybody wants to get behind. A lot of people just want the console experience, and I don't mean locked frame rates and stick drift. They want the sort of experience that the Xbox Ally is promising them, even though it's a Windows handheld, and we all know what the problem with that is. And this is why the super console market is exploding right now. Not literally, they're perfectly safe. They're not going to explode on you. They're not Teslas. You know the ones, the preloaded grandma could run this Android boxes of nostalgia that sit under your telly. They're for people who don't want to map buttons and tinker with hardware. They want to play games on a device that actually has enough horsepower to make the experience frictionless. What they want is something like the Kinhank X5 Pro. This is a little Android TV box with a 4TB hard drive included, which has over 16,000 games on that just work. Well, I mean, kind of. We'll come to that a little bit later. But this isn't a new device. It's something that's been around for quite a while now. Paired with a fairly powerful Android box, you have a relatively large 4TB hard drive and a relatively cheap wireless controller that is nevertheless from a good company with a fairly good pedigree. It's like the border collie of the game controller market. Other reviewers have covered this device years ago in some instances, and I never thought that I would get a chance to take a look at it. Since then, the price has gone up. Some of the components have changed a little, and we have to ask ourselves the question, is what we get now the same as what you would have got back then? I mean, right now we're in the middle of this RAM-pocalypse, and companies are cutting costs here and there to try and make up for any downfall and putting prices up where they can't. This has been a really well-reviewed unit in the past. Should it be considered the same now? We have to ask ourselves that question. Is the Kinhank X5 a box set you want to binge, or a package you'd rather return to sender? I have to start by saying this. This unit was sent over by Kinhank for review, but they've got no editorial control over what I say. Originally, they actually wanted to send me a thing called a Motion X, which is a bit like a kid's console where you jump up and down in front of a television, waving your arms in order to play a game, and somehow it just didn't seem like me. Some of the games are far too sophisticated for a start. Anyway, what comes in this box is 3 different boxes. The first one contains the unit itself, which is a small, sleek, black device like any number of small, sleek, black Android devices that you can get anywhere. But this one's got a little bit of a trick up its sleeve, with a much more powerful processor and a good amount of RAM to boot. And to boot it, all you've got to do is plug it in with the included cables. There's everything that you need here in order to get the package working, including an HDMI cable, which you often don't get in the box of these things. You also get a SATA cable that plugs into the unit that's in box number 2. Box number 2, I should actually call polystyrene container number 2, contains a 3.5-inch Seagate ST4000DM000. It's an internal hard drive, basically, but the model that you would usually get if you wanted to store footage from CCTV cameras. It's not bad as it goes, and it should be pretty good for the sort of rewriting and reading that you would be doing when you're playing games. But crucially, it's not as good as some of the reviewers have had in the past, where they've had either Iron Wolf or Skyhawk devices. Still, this is a Seagate drive, and it will do the job that we need it to do. There is, however, no enclosure, so this thing is just meant to sit naked on your desk, bare metal and PCBs on show. So exposed is this that if you really want to see a full set of pictures, then you're going to have to join its OnlyFans. Now, I'm not wholly comfortable with the way that this has been done. It's fine, I'm sure. But what I think I'm going to try and do is get a little cable tidy box and put it in there instead. The other option, of course, is to buy your own enclosure, but that turns this from a SATA drive into a USB 3. And nevertheless, for what you're going to be playing on here, that should be fast enough. But you would have to remap all of the drives, and you would need an extra plug. Actually, that's becoming increasingly difficult with the amount of stuff that I've got plugged in. The third box, and by this time your subconscious has started to believe that it's Christmas Day, and it's very disappointed when it doesn't get macaroni and cheese for dinner. The third box contains a GameSir wireless T3 controller. This is towards the budget end of GameSir devices, but nevertheless it's still a pretty competent controller and can still play all of the games that you grew up playing. Inside the actual unit, you've got the 8-core RK3588S chip, which includes Bluetooth 5.2, Wi-Fi 6, and a gigabit port. You've got 4 USB 3 ports, 1 USB-C port, 1 SATA 3.0 port, and a partridge in a and 8 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM. This is an impressive little Android box, and if you got this to watch Netflix or YouTube, you would be very, very happy with it. When you boot everything up, you've got a choice of 2 front ends, Pegasus or ESDE. Now look, I am much more familiar with using ESDE, but I actually quite liked the Pegasus experience on here. The one problem is the amount of time it takes to load up all the systems at the beginning, because it seems to scan your game files every single time you click on the icon to load this up. And I'm somebody who grew up in the age of pressing play on a tape deck and then nipping to the shops whilst the game loaded, but I still found myself clawing at the walls, waiting for the game list to appear. ESDE, on the other hand, seems to boot relatively quickly. You still scan stuff, but it didn't seem to take quite as long, although I much prefer the layout of Pegasus for scanning through games on a television. This can, of course, be changed by downloading a new theme for ESDE. The other, let's not call it a problem, let's call it a feature of Pegasus, it is quite annoying, is the soundtrack that plays in the background. It's basically a selection of fairly light and fairly airy 8-bit chiptunes. There are some quite nice recommendations, some popular songs included, but even those will definitely chip away at your sanity over time. Pegasus feels like an awful lot more of a locked-down system than ESDE, and that does feel somewhat compromised if you decided you want to make a change, like turning the music off. That should be a fairly basic function, but I just couldn't find out how to do it. But the main selling point of this device is really the 4 terabytes of curated games that you get on the disc. I say 4 terabytes, it's actually, you've got about 230 gig left if you want to add your own titles, although that's not very much. You know, you're not going to get many Switch games for that 230 gig. But that still leaves you with an impressive haul of over 16,000 games. You don't have everything for every system, though. Nintendo DS, for example, only has about 15 titles. Nintendo Switch only has one. But with over 450 3DS games, 300 Master System games, 900 Genesis games, 800 SNES games, 2,000 PlayStation 1 games, you've got a fair amount to keep you occupied. You also have 653 PS2 and 624 GameCube games. All of these are 1G, 1R games. That means for each game you get one ROM. A few odd things here and there where you've got more than one disc for a game, so you see the cover pop up more than once, but you don't get any of the sort of junk regional variants that you often get with collections like this. This is very well curated, and a good chunk of what you're paying for here is the out-of-the-box readiness. You know, the granny test that I said earlier. If you gave this to your grandmother, would she be able to suck eggs with it? Now, the important caveat to point out here, of course, is that none of these games are going to be licensed. I'm not saying that as some sort of moral verdict of a judgment. You're a grown-up. It's up for you to decide whether or not that's a problem. But as far as I can see, a big chunk of what you're actually paying for here is the time that's been spent assembling and curating a collection of games. I think you've got to ask yourself, how long would this have taken you to do for yourself, to spend those hours collecting the games, scraping the artwork, configuring the systems? The RK3588S in this device is actually pretty good. It's able to handle both PS2 and GameCube at 2x and 3x resolution, occasionally dropping down to native for some of the harder to emulate titles. That means everything below this is handled with the sort of comfort that you might find if you made a house out of chocolate fondant. The device doesn't really struggle with most things unless you're dealing with a system that is particularly difficult to emulate anyway. Sega Saturn, for example, stutters when you try to run more demanding 3D intensive titles. Wii and occasionally GameCube has these micro stutters as it tries to load in assets. But crucially, on those systems, if you go back and then play the same thing again, everything seems to be smoothed over because the caches are already set up. The real surprise here, though, has to be 3DS, which has been a little bit too good. It does make me wonder whether this chip might actually be a good option in a more budget-friendly, dual-screen 3DS-style device. It's not perfect. I did have a little bit of slowdown in Mario Kart 7, but Super Mario Land, which usually suffers from shader compilation quite badly, was actually pretty solid. Of course, you still have the odd game like Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon that puts a ghost in the machine. It just won't run very well at all, and that's a limit of the emulation more than anything else. Jaguar is also a little rough, but let's face it, the Jaguar console was also a little rough. Okay, that might be a little bit unfair, but I did have problems playing a few titles. Tempest in particular got down to sometimes 11, 12 frames a second, and there was a lot of slowdown. And not everything that I tried ran at the 60 frames a second, although most of it was playable. But that is disappointing on a much older console. Switch has only one included game, and I suspect that's because Switch emulation on this is likely not going to be amazing. I've got to admit that I haven't tested it myself because there's only one game that they supplied with this, and that game works perfectly. But we know that this is a less powerful chip than, say, the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Ambonic 477M, and it doesn't have access to turnip drivers to smooth over any issues with drivers. You're not going to have the full catalogue supported here, I'm convinced of it. The one thing you're going to need to do for all of these systems is make sure you don't lose the TV remote. Earlier reviews of this showed a controller that had a dongle attached to it, and it seemed to be super quick and really responsive. When I first got this out of the box, it had no dongle, and it seemed about as responsive as a turkey after it's been plucked, stuffed, cooked for 12 hours, and then served with macaroni and cheese. Out of the box, this is an IR controller. It's slow, laggy, and enough to make you yearn for the days of Commodore 64 loading times. But you can press the back button and the home key together until the controller flashes green, and then pair the controller with the Android box using the Android settings menu. This changes the game completely. It makes this Android box actually more responsive than my quite expensive smart TV, and without any of the adverts that they force into your living room every time you turn it on. In fact, quite apart from just playing the included games on this thing, there is no reason why you shouldn't consider this, to link up to Steam or to a game streaming service and stream your games over the internet. Apparently, that's the next big thing. Of course, to do that, you need a controller. The GameSir T3 is actually pretty good for a budget controller. It's getting on a bit now, so it still has things like micro USB charging, and it does auto-disconnect itself ever so quickly if you nip up to the loo for a pee. Whilst it does feel like a toy, it's important to remember that it really is a budget device. The face buttons are quite big and all the controls are clicky and plasticky, which is fine for a budget device. The D-pad isn't my favourite. It easily passes the Kirby pancake test, but that's really because you just can't rock this thing backwards and forwards at all. If you're a fan of fighting games, you may have a little bit of a problem rolling the controls here. The buttons are quite plasticky and clicky with very little travel, but again, they're perfectly serviceable for what you get. And the same can be said about the shoulder buttons. There is nothing special here. They feel a little bit cheap. And you know what? Some of the cheaper retro handhelds that I've reviewed on this channel have actually done this an awful lot better. There are even some reports about sticks failing within weeks of having a unit, or the X button dying, or charging taking a really long time, but I've not run into any of those issues myself, possibly because I've just not had it for very long. Personally, I've docked an 8-bit Do Pro 3 to this, and I was having quite a lot of fun using that instead. One thing I should say is that a lot of the decisions, a lot of the hotkeys and configurations are actually given to you in the instruction manual, so don't lose that. There's also an included FAQ card with QR codes that let you jump to answers to various questions. So what I found here is some good stuff and some bad stuff, and by and large, I think the good stuff far outweighs the bad. If you've got a bedroom TV or a spare room TV that isn't smart, then this can double as a streaming device for that room and a gaming box at the same time. Now, you could go out and buy all of these components yourself, but with the controller costing $30 and the ever-increasing price of hard drives right now, I think you'd be hard-pressed to get something for around about the same price with this much power. And on top of that, you still have all of those games to collate as well, the box art to scrape and the emulation setup to do yourself. The Kinhank X5 Pro then is not for everybody. If you want to go to the trouble of making your own PC and sourcing your own ROMs, then you'll undoubtedly get a lot more for less, because you can make smart compromises that you can't do when buying a complete package like this. But if you want a box that you can just plug in and start playing Mario Kart with in 30 seconds, then actually this is pretty polished. A few hiccups along the way, but actually pretty polished nevertheless. This is software and a service product that happens to come with all of the hardware that you need to make it work. And because of that, it's actually worth the asking price. But as good as I think this is, there are a lot of people who just won't need it. And I think you have to be very honest with yourself when you're asking whether or not you want to get this. Because if it's just for the games, then actually Kinhank will sell you the drive on its own. And if it's just for the streaming box, then there are other cheaper options available as well. Well, that's what I think anyway, and I would love to know what you think in the comments below. And whilst you're down there, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel, then there is also a Patreon link available. That's very important to me at the moment, unfortunately. It's been really interesting taking a look at this device, and I'd love to take a look at more stuff like this as well. Well, we'll see what happens in the future, whether anybody approaches me. But for now, that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come and join me again next time we enter the Retro Corner. But until then, thank you ever so much for watching, and happy gaming.